and welcome to this deeply reflective episode of Springfield Career Insights. Tonight, we address a matter that touches families, workplaces, and institutions alike: the rising tide of emotional distress and suicide within Eswatini. In a world where speed often overshadows empathy, we ask, how do we heal? Joining us is Professor Dr. Godfrey Gandawa, a visionary educator, institutional founder, and one of the leading voices in redefining mental wellness across Africa. From pioneering Springfield Research University's Master of Social Science in Mental Health to launching a fully integrated counseling and psychology studio, Dr. Gandawa stands at the frontier of a new kind of education, one that teaches us not just what to know, but how to live. Professor, welcome to the show.
Good evening, Advocate. Thank you for having me, and good evening to the viewers.
Professor, before we talk solutions, let's start with the crisis. Eswatini currently records one of the world's highest suicide rates. What goes through your mind as an educator and leader when you hear those numbers?
And thank you, Advocate, for the question. What goes through my mind is not just data, it's devastation. Behind every digit is a name, a voice that was silenced, a story that will never finish a sentence. When I hear that Eswatini ranks among the world's highest in suicide rates, I feel a rupture, not just in statistics, but in our collective soul. It tells me our systems are producing knowledge, but neglecting emotional survival. That somewhere between teaching and training, we forgot how to care. As a leader, I do not interpret these numbers academically. I interpret them as institutional failure. When a soldier, a teacher, a young person chooses to exit life rather than enjoy it, then the curriculum has collapsed. The family scaffolding has buckled, and leadership must respond with more than condolences. It must respond with structure. At Springfield Research University, we say mental health is infrastructure because healing must be built into the very design of education, relationships, and governance. Suicide is not a decision. It is a symptom of systems that have ignored suffering. And until we educate with empathy, we will continue to mourn brilliance lost. So, yes, I hear these numbers, and what goes through my mind is we must rehumanize leadership. And now.
You've stood at the helm of Springfield Research University during challenging times. Why did mental health become central to your leadership agenda?
Thank you, Advocate. Because leading a university isn't just about degrees. It's about dignity. And I realized early on that no curriculum, no innovation, no summit means anything if the people carrying them are quietly collapsing inside. Mental health became central to my agenda, not by convenience, but by crisis. I witnessed brilliance buried under depression, faculty losing focus not due to incompetence but untreated trauma, students disengaging not because they lacked ambition, but because they lacked emotional tools to survive their own narratives. At SRU, we are not just preparing scholars, we are preparing humans. That's why we built the Counseling and Psychology Studio as part of the academic spine. That's why we launched the Master of Social Science in Mental Health to professionalize healing and localize empathy. Mental health is not a sidebar. It's in the system software behind every form of excellence. And any leadership that ignores it is administering a share. And I choose not to lead a share. I chose to lead a sanctuary.
A big question is, why are we losing lives? From your perspectives, what are the underlying causes behind the rising suicide rates, especially in Eswatini's general population?
Thank you, Advocate, for the question. So at the heart of this crisis is not simply despair, it's disconnection. In Eswatini today, many wake up not to opportunity, but to isolation. What we are witnessing isn't just individual breakdowns, it's societal burnout. 3 fault lines come to mind. First, economic instability. When entire communities live on the edge of survival, emotional resilience begins to fray. And without systemic support, stress mutates into hopelessness. Second, emotional illiteracy. We have taught generations how to calculate, construct, and comply, but never how to feel. Emotional expression is often shamed. Healing is dismissed as weakness, and trauma remains undocumented except in silence. Third, mental health infrastructure gaps. In most regions, especially in rural ones, professional care is neither unavailable or unaffordable. People are grieving without therapists, suffering without safe places, dying without diagnosis. This cocktail of pain, poverty, silence, and unavailability is what drives the numbers up. And yet, suicide isn't the disease. It's the loudest symptom of how disconnected we have become from our emotional humanity. That's why at SRU, mental health isn't just an add-on. It's a design principle, because healing must be systemic, not seasonal, institutional, not incidental.
Wow, that's insightful, Professor. What cultural or systemic patterns have you observed that might be fueling the silent epidemic of mental distress?
Thank you, Advocate, for this question. There is a silence stitched into our culture, and it's dressed as strength. Across Eswatini and many African societies, we have normalized emotional depression. We teach our children to endure pain quietly, to label tears as weakness, and to see therapy as taboo. What we call resilience sometimes becomes emotional erasure. Systemically, our institutions reflect this silence. Schools reward performance but rarely measure emotional well-being. Workplaces demand productivity while offering no space for healing. Even in families, trauma often travels by inheritance, unspoken but deeply felt. Relationally, we are facing a crisis of disconnection. Technology connects our devices, but not our souls. Spiritual frameworks are thinning, and community bonds are rooted in Ubuntu have been frayed by modern isolation. So this creates an ecosystem where the wounded walk silently among us, unsupported and unseen. The result? A society where pain is privatized, healing is outsourced, if it's even accessed, and suicide becomes the voice of emotions that were never allowed to speak. At SRU, we confront this not just culturally, but structurally. We embed wellness into curriculum, normalize counseling within student life, and treat emotional literacy as a leadership skill. Because changing the culture begins by redesigning the system and redefining what it means to be whole.
Thank you, Professor. Do you believe public policy and institutional support have lagged behind the emotional needs of our people?
Absolutely, advocate. There is no polite way to say it. The emotional needs of our people have outpaced our policies by decades. We have legislated infrastructure for roads, schools, and power, but not for resilience, healing, or human restoration. Public institutions often measure success by output, not by wellness. We fund buildings before we fund belonging. We count literacy rates, but not the silent depression behind those numbers. And in this lag, countless lives fall through the cracks, especially the invisible ones. Mental health doesn't yet live inside our constitutions, our budgets, or our strategic frameworks. It remains peripheral, reactive, and sometimes political when it should be personal, structural, and sacred. What we need is a policy pivot from compliancy to compassion. SRU embodies that shift. We didn't wait for legislation. No, we became the legislation. By creating therapeutic curricula, embedding psychological studios, and launching degree programs like the Master of Social Science and Mental Health, we have built the infrastructure that policy must now catch up to. Until our institutions treat emotional well-being as a civic priority, we will continue to bury talent in silence. Healing must be budgeted, legislated, and localized, because wellness isn't charity, it's continental strategy.
That's very true, Professor. Thank you. Let's turn to the uniformed sector. Why do you believe suicide and trauma are particularly high among security forces?
Thank you, Advocate, for this pertinent question. Because in the uniformed sector, service is visible, but suffering is not. The trauma accumulated by soldiers, police officers, and security agents often goes unacknowledged, buried beneath discipline, rank, and duty. These are professions that demand composure while witnessing chaos, and the emotional toll is profound. We must understand this. Security personnel are trained to protect others, but rarely taught how to protect themselves mentally. Exposure to violence, moral injury, internalized fear, and hypervigilance become part of daily life. And in institutions where vulnerability is treated as weakness, therapy is seen as betrayal. Then there is the structural silence. Most law enforcement frameworks in Eswatini and across Africa lack trauma debriefing protocols, psychological check-ins, or embedded counseling units. Emotional suppression becomes a standard, and suicide, tragically, becomes the final release of many who feel they cannot speak. At SRU, we view uniformed trauma as not just a clinical issue, but a curriculum issue. We have begun designing modules and interventions aimed at mental health literacy for disciplined forces. Because healing must be tactical, embedded, and non-negotiable. You cannot safeguard a nation if the guardians themselves are wounded and unseen.
Thank you, Professor. How has toxic masculinity and stoicism contributed to emotional suppression among law enforcement and military personnel?
Thank you, Advocate, for the question. In our uniformed sectors, masculinity is often weaponized, but never healed. Toxic masculinity and stoicism have created emotional prisons where vulnerability is forbidden and silence is seen as strength. We train our officers to be tough, tactical, and unshaken, but never tender, never transparent. The problem isn't masculinity, it's a mutation. What begins as discipline ends as denial. Officers bottle grief, suppress trauma, and wear pain like part of the uniform. Stoicism becomes not a virtue, but a mask that cracks in private, often too late. Imagine facing daily violence, moral dilemmas, life and death pressure, yet being told that therapy is weakness, that expressing emotion jeopardizes command. We have built systems that silence their protectors, expecting mental endurance while denying mental infrastructure. At SRU, we deconstruct this model through pedagogical healing. We advocate for masculine wellness rooted in emotional literacy, spiritual resilience, and structured debriefing. Because the man in uniform isn't just a law enforcer. He is a soul in service. And if we fail to honor his inner life, we weaponize trauma instead of safeguarding peace.
Wow. Thank you, Professor. What kind of mental wellness infrastructure do you believe institutions like the police and military should adopt? And can SRU's model be adopted for that?
Thank you, Advocate, for this question. So, institutions like the police and military even the prison services, must evolve beyond command structures. They need companion architecture. Mental wellness in disciplined services cannot be reactive or optional. It must be woven in the operational fabric of the institution. What do I mean by infrastructure? 3 things. First, mandatory trauma debriefing. Regular, structured sessions that allow personnel to process high-stress events, not just physically, but emotionally. Silence after service is dangerous. Talking must become a doctrine. Second, embedded clinical units. On-site psychological services with trained therapists who understand both the culture and context of uniformed life. Therapy should not be an external referral. It should be part of the institutional map. And third, emotional literacy modules. So designed specifically for cadets, officers, and even generals. We must train them not only in tactics, but in self-awareness, grief processing, and empathy under pressure. Can SRIU's model be adopted? Absolutely. Our counseling and psychology studio, paired with the Master of Social Science and Mental Health, already operates as a prototype. We teach therapeutic leadership, culturally rooted healing, and sovereign wellness. We can reframe these tools for military academies, police colleges, and government schools. Because safeguarding society requires healing its guardians first. Otherwise, we build defense systems led by wounded defenders.
Thank you, Professor. In your experience, how are relationship breakdowns, whether romantic, familial, or intergenerational, impacting mental health across Eswatini?
Thank you, Advocate, for this brilliant question. They are not just impacting mental health, they are unraveling identity. So, in Eswatini, relationship breakdowns have become one of the most silent but seismic forces behind emotional collapse. Romantic bonds are fraying under financial pressure, digital distractions, and shifting gender expectations. The very language of intimacy is being lost, replaced by transactional communication and emotional distance. When love becomes negotiable, wellness begins to wither. Familial relationships are also under siege. Parents are battling unprocessed trauma while trying to raise emotionally literate children with no roadmap. The result is a home of silence, not safety. Discipline replaces dialogue, and generational pain is passed down like inheritance. Then there is the intergenerational divide. Elders feeling abandoned, youth feeling unheard. Cultural bridges are collapsing. Wisdom is not flowing. Emotional mentorship is rare. All of this creates an epidemic of isolation. And in isolation, the mind folds inward. Depression deepens. Anxiety tightens. Suicide whispers. At SRU, we respond by reconstructing rational literacy, teaching learners to not only pass exams, but to build bonds. Our therapeutic models include Ubuntu counseling, dialogic healing, and indigenous frameworks for restoring emotional kinship. Because to heal a society, you must first restore how it relates.
Thank you, Professor. You often speak about emotional literacy. Why is it so vital, and why isn't it taught in schools or communities?
Thank you, Advocate, for the question. Because emotional literacy is the language of survival. And we are graduating generations who do not speak it. It is the ability to recognize, articulate, and respond to emotions, not just in ourselves, but in others. Without it, we produce citizens who cannot read, compute, and debate, yet still collapse silently under emotional storms they cannot name. Why is it vital? Because emotion drives every human interaction, in love, in leadership, in learning. A student who cannot process anxiety will flee knowledge. A teacher who cannot regulate frustration will harm with words. A leader who cannot navigate shame or fear will weaponize power. Emotional literacy is the firewall against these fractures. And yet, it remains absent from most classrooms. Why? Because we have inherited curricula designed for industrial productivity, not human flourishing. Schools are built to standardize, not to empathize. Communities often confuse discipline with emotional shutdown. Vulnerability is rare. Expression is regulated. Healing is postponed. At Springfield Research University, we flipped the model. Emotional literacy is taught through psychocultural modules, therapeutic mentorship, and indigenous storytelling. Because we lead Africa into its sovereign renaissance, we must first teach its children how to feel.
Thank you, Professor. How can culturally sensitive counseling empower individuals to heal both personally and relationally?
Thank you, Advocate, for this question. Because true healing must speak the language of the wound. Culturally sensitive counseling understands not just the pain, but the context from which that pain was born. So in Eswatini and across much of Africa, emotional trauma is often woven into family norms, spiritual beliefs, historical dislocation, and communal silence. Healing must respect those textures. When we counsel without culture, we risk misdiagnosing strength as a disorder or silence as stability. But when therapy honors ancestral wisdom, indigenous values, and relational nuance, it becomes not an intervention, but a reunion, a return to self. Personally, it allows the individual to feel seen, not filtered through Western models or foreign matrices, but embraced through familiar rhythm, language, and story. Relationally, it reopens conversation between generations, between genders, between grief and hope. At SRU, we teach this through Ubuntu-based frameworks, psycho-spiritual mapping, and dialogic restoration. Our counselors are not just technicians of the mind. They are translators of emotion across culture and history. Because in order to heal Africa, we must first learn how Africa mourns, how it loves, and how it whispers its pain. Only then can healing become sovereignty.
Thank you, Professor. Let's take a break and listen to a song called Echoes of Healing.
Through the halls of Springfield, voices rise, seeking hope beyond the pain in their eyes. In the science of the soul, we break through, turning knowledge into healing pure and true. We stand together, hearts set free. Springfield lives as strong as can be. Through the trials, through the fight, mental health shines in the morning light. Every heartbeat tells a tale untold. Through research and care, futures unfold. Breaking silence, lifting voices high. Springfield stands where the echoes fly. Beyond the fear, beyond the past, we rise with strength. We learn so fast. The power of thought, the will to mend. A journey of care that never ends. We stand together, hearts set free. Springfield lives as strong as can be. Through the trials, through the fight, mental health shines in the morning light.
Welcome back. Let's continue with our discussion. Springfield offers a Master of Social Science in Mental Health. What philosophy underpins this program?
Thank you, Advocate, for this question. The philosophy behind our Master of Social Science and Mental Health is simple, but revolutionary. Healing is not a supplement to education. It is its foundation. This program was born from the recognition that mental wellness must be professionalized, not as an imported clinical model, but as a sovereign academic discipline rooted in African realities. At Springfield, We treat mental health as infrastructure. Just as nations build roads and hospitals, we must build emotional resilience, trained empathy, and localized therapy systems. Our curriculum fuses clinical psychology with indigenous therapeutic frameworks, emotional literacy, and policy innovation. We are training a new generation of wellness architects, not just counselors, but nation builders who understand the psychology of culture, community, and crisis. Graduates emerge not only with diagnostic skills, but with the philosophical clarity to heal relational trauma, institutional silence, and generational wounds. They learn to counsel in context, diagnose with compassion, and lead with emotional depth. Because mental health in Africa cannot be outsourced, it must be authored. This degree is how we begin that authorship.
This is great, Professor. Thank you. How do you train students not just to diagnose, but to heal with cultural depth and emotional intelligence?
Thank you, Advocate, for the question. We train them to listen not just with the mind, but with memory. Memory of culture, of story, of silence, of the unspoken grief etched into the architecture of African life. Because diagnosis is not healing, it's recognition. Healing begins when recognition is followed by ritual, relevance, and relationship. At Springfield Research University, we dismantle the clinical ivory tower. Our students are immersed in psychocultural immersion labs, Ubuntu counseling frameworks, and empathy-led simulations rooted in real community narratives. They learn that a tiye in Magunje, in Mushume, in Hlangano, in Mangayane is not the same as a tiye in Madrid. So therapy must translate across geography, history, and ancestry. Emotional intelligence is not taught. It is cultivated. We use storytelling, spiritual anthropology, dialogue cycles, and indigenous metaphors to awaken emotional depth. Students are not just assessed on academic performance, they are mentored through emotional embodiment. Our program builds healers, not technicians, because Africa needs professionals who can repair its wounds without erasing its essence. And that requires cultural depth, emotional fluency, and the humility to sit with pain before prescribing solutions.
Thank you, Professor. Do you see this academic offering as part of a larger continental movement towards educational models that prioritize mental wellness?
Thank you, Advocate, for this question. Absolutely. And not just a movement, but a continental metamorphosis. The Master of Social Science and Mental Health is more than a degree. It's a declaration. A declaration that Africa must reimagine education not only as a tool of knowledge transfer, but as a sanctuary for psychological regeneration. We are witnessing a slow but seismic shift across African institutions. Where mental wellness was once peripheral, it is now emerging as core infrastructure because nations are beginning to understand. You cannot industrialize broken minds, nor govern fractured spirits. Our academic offering sits at the heart of this renaissance. It fuses traditional wisdom with therapeutic strategy, policy reform with cultural healing. It trains not only counselors, but wellness strategists, policy reformers, and curriculum disruptors. Each graduate becomes a node in Africa's emotional rebirth. Yes, this is a movement, and SRU is one of its architects because the continent cannot ascend without first becoming emotionally literate, spiritually grounded, and institutionally compassionate. This degree plants seeds not just in classrooms, but in ministries, villages, and multilateral platforms.
Thank you, Professor. SRU also houses its own counseling and psychology studio. What inspired this integration directly into the university ecosystem?
Thank you, Advocate, for the question. It was born out of necessity and vision. I have always believed that a university must reflect the needs of its people, not just the aspirations of its curricula. The counseling and psychology studio was not added, it was embedded like a heartbeat within the institution's chest. What inspired its integration was witnessing a crisis masquerading as silence. Brilliant students walking into lecture halls with invisible wounds. Educators pouring themselves into pedagogy while privately grieving, breaking, burning out. And I asked myself, how do we expect minds to excel when souls are unwell? Traditional academia treats therapy as external, a referral, a service. But SRU treats healing as internal, as constitutional. You're a lawyer. The studio sits at the core of our ecosystem because we don't educate without empathizing. We have designed it to offer localized, culturally rooted therapies, Ubuntu-based counseling, psycho-spiritual mapping, dialogic healing, not just treatment, but restoration. And more than that, it's symbolic. The studio reminds everyone who enters SRU that emotional safety is not a luxury. It is our infrastructure. It is our ethic. It is our curriculum.
This is great, Professor. Thank you. What kinds of therapies or approaches are practiced there? And how do they differ from conventional clinical models?
Thank you, Advocate, for the question. So at the SRU Counseling and Psychology Studio, therapy is not a transaction. It's a transformation. We practice approaches that aren't just clinically sound, but culturally fluent. Because healing must resonate, not just regulate. Unlike conventional models that often mirror Western frameworks of diagnosis and treatment, our therapies speak the language of the land. So we integrate Ubuntu-based counseling rooted in collective empathy, spiritual connectedness, and community restoration. It's not just I feel, but we heal. Psychospiritual mapping, identifying emotional wounds through the lenses of ancestral memory, ritual absence, and spiritual dislocation. This allows trauma to be named in its cultural dialect. Then, dialogic healing circles, where storytelling becomes therapy and silence becomes shared reflection. The goal isn't merely catharsis, but communal coherence. Grief rituals and symbolic restoration. We help individuals reclaim identity by reviving the indigenous ceremonies that once held pain with dignity. These methods contrast sharply with clinical models that may prioritize pharmacological or standardized matrices. So ours prioritize narrative integrity, emotional immersion, and cultural consonance. In short, we are not just healing minds, we are restoring meaning. Therapy here doesn't sterilize, it sanctifies. Because to truly heal Eswatini, we must let therapy wear the soil of its people.
Wow. Thank you, Professor. How do you define pedagogical healing, and why must institutions become sanctuaries and not just campuses?
Thank you very much, Advocate. Pedagogical healing is not a classroom concept. It's a design principle for every space where humans thrive and suffer. I define it as the act of building environments, educational, professional, institutional, that are emotionally reparative, spiritually intelligent, and culturally grounded. We are not just talking about learners. We are talking about leaders, employees, officers, ministers, because trauma doesn't discriminate by job title. Whether it's a boardroom or a lecture hall, an executive suite or a workshop bench, the need for healing is universal. Institutions must become sanctuaries, not just campuses, because the crisis is ambient. People are arriving into spaces of learning and work with the grief hidden behind goals, anxiety woven into ambition. If our systems don't offer emotional oxygen, they quietly produce emotional suffocation. At SRU, pedagogical healing means mindfulness in meetings, mentoring with empathy, curriculum infused with care. It means staff wellness embedded in policy and leadership trained in emotional intelligence, not just strategy. because education isn't limited to degrees and work isn't limited to output. Both are human ecosystems, and if we fail to design them for wellness, we design them for collapse. Africa's renaissance will be led not just by thinkers, but by the healed thinkers, by workplaces that breathe, by universities that restore, by sanctuaries of innovation, dignity, and emotional sovereignty.
That's very true, Professor. Trauma doesn't discriminate. You have said before that mental health is infrastructure. What does that mean for Africa today?
Thank you, Advocate. It means that healing must be built, not borrowed. When I say mental health is infrastructure, I am calling for a complete reimagining of how African nations design their futures. Because just as we invest in roads, hospitals, and power grids, we must invest in the emotional resilience of our people. That is infrastructure. That is survival. For Africa today, this phrase is both a blueprint and a warning. We cannot digitize economies while ignoring depression. We cannot build political movements on fractured psyches. We cannot teach innovation to minds weighed down by inherited trauma. Infrastructure implies permanence, budget, structure, planning. So, mental wellness must live inside ministries, school policies, HR departments, urban planning, and leadership training. Not as charity, not as crisis response, but as standard, sustainable architecture for every system. At SRU, we have laid the first stones: therapeutic campuses, emotional literacy curricula, sovereign counseling models. But this vision is continental. Every village, workplace, and parliament should breathe wellness. Because without emotional infrastructure, development is cosmetic and healing becomes accidental.
Thank you, Professor. If you were to send a message to governments, educators, and parents across the continent, what should they hear loud and clear?
They should hear this not as advice, but as a warning wrapped in love. Africa will not heal until its caregivers become curators of wellness. To governments, mental health is not a ministry, it's a mandate, budgeted, legislated, embedded into national planning alongside roads and broadband. Because broken minds do not build sovereign nations. To educators, stop teaching minds disconnected from hearts. Emotional literacy is not extracurricular. It is the syllabus of survival. You are not just instructors, you are healers. Teach like lives depend on it, because they do. To parents, silence is not wisdom. Discipline without dialogue is emotional exile. Raise children who can speak their pain, own their joy, and rewrite their inheritance. Your homes are the first ministries of healing. And to married couples and romantic partners, love must never be lethal. Too many homes have become battlegrounds because behind closed doors, where intimacy collapses into violence and affection is replaced with fear. Emotional literacy must live in marriage vows. Counseling must be normalized in courtship. Conflict must be navigated with compassion, not control. Because if the bedroom becomes a war zone, the nation bleeds from the core. And to all, mental health must be African, sovereign, sacred. It must wear our soil, sing our stories, and rebuild our spirits. This is not just a message, it's a manifesto. Because if we do not architect wellness, we will keep burying brilliance in silence.
That's a very powerful message, Professor. Thank you. And lastly, what legacy would you like to leave in this space where education becomes a healing force?
Thank you, advocates. I want the legacy to be more than a curriculum. It must be a continental pulse. A legacy where education is no longer confined to syllabi, but expands as a sanctuary. A legacy where universities breathe empathy, workplaces echo emotional safety, and leadership embodies healing. I want Springfield Research University remembered, not merely as an institution, but as a prototype of possibility. A place where the architecture of learning and the architecture of healing are indistinguishable, where knowledge and kindness share the same corridor. I want every student, staff member, leader, and partner to leave not just with degrees, but with dignity restored. That they go back into villages, ministries, homes, and industries, not only qualified, but emotionally literate, spiritually rooted, and culturally fluent. The legacy must be a philosophy embedded in policy, a pedagogy that heals pain, not just prepares professions, a blueprint where healing is sovereign, scalable, and sacred. If we have done this right, then when the continent speaks of mental wellness, our model will not just be referenced, it will be remembered. Thank you, Advocate, for having me.
Professor, thank you. Your reflections have powerfully redefined how we perceive mental health, not simply as a pathway to success, but as a sanctuary for restoration. Thank you for illuminating emotional literacy, pedagogical healing, and the soul work woven into Springfield's academic design. To our viewers, if you believe Africa's future demands more than qualifications, that it requires healed minds, emotionally intelligent educators, and institutions built to restore, then we invite you to discover our offering at Springfield Research University. Visit www.springfieldresearchuniversity.net and begin your journey towards becoming a healed soul, a sovereign educator, a wellness strategist, and a curriculum designer for you. That brings us to the end of this transformative episode of Springfield Career Insights. We hope this conversation has not only informed but inspired. Let its message guide your next steps, from learning to leading, from knowledge to kindness, from ambition to emotional sovereignty. I am Clarence, your host. Until next time, may your career be conscious, your leadership compassionate, and your journey rooted in wellness. Good night.
Hey, hey, siyakhuphuka